It may not be Batman, but it's the next best thing. Come and join me as I show you how I painted and animated this model. If you're new to the channel, and trust me, I don't blame you if you are, I'm not making a tutorial. I'm simply documenting my journey and showing some of the challenges I had when painting and animating this model. As you can see, this is just one of many models. If you'd like to see how I painted the rest, you can check them out on my channel. We begin by laying down our base colors. I knew from the beginning that this was going to be a sleek and elegant model, so I wanted the color to match. And I don't know about you, but I do fancy some black to be sleek and elegant. Black can be a very strong color, but on its own, it's not going to look very good. In my opinion, most monochrome models need to be done very well, or else they just look flat. And that's not quite what I'm going for. In this universe, everything is nice, bright, and colorful, so the black needs to be colorful to match. And one way we can do that is by doing some contrast, by having some silverish, whitish, grayish material, just highlighting the black and breaking up the silhouette. When working with black, it's tempting to use a pure white as a contrast. And while it can look good, it's a bit of a trap, because if you use it as a base coat, you won't be able to highlight to a lighter color later on. The art style I'm going for is to use the texture paint to sort of fake shadows and make it look like the light's catching on areas despite the fact that there is no light. Just remember to go through all the parts of your model and get all the nooks and crannies. Separate as much as you can if the geometry allows, and you'll have a very nice looking model. Now we'll move on to a minor part of the model, but it's still very important. These little glowy bits here. I've chosen to make them blue for reasons that'll become a little bit obvious later when we do some touch-ups on the black. For now though, all you need to know is we need to start bright at the back and then make darker and darker highlights towards the middle. This will really sell the glow effect. Sometimes though, the mesh just will not cooperate with you and it'll produce these weird artifacty looking things. Looks like the problem was that I had copied the UV data from one gun to the other, and something must have gotten corrupted during that process, as when I painted on the second gun, it would always produce those weird effects. I solved this by just deleting the duplicate and painting on the original. I'll then duplicate it once I've actually painted it, so I won't have this problem. I'll finish up the glow part by adding this darkest spot in the middle. It's important when painting in this style that you use at least 3 hues. 2 is too flat, and 4 can be good when you need a highly detailed showpiece, but for small things like this, 3 is perfect. Now that we know what to do, it's just a matter of putting it into practice. We'll start by this little outlet thingy here by the cables, then we'll move on to the thrusters, and finally we'll end on the vent. We're moving on to an important part here, the cockpit. We want to start with a very dark color and then make it lighter and lighter as we go to the top. This is trying to make it look like the light's being diffused as it goes through the glass in the interior. It is at this point during the process that your brother or similar sibling may walk in with a burning question that they won't allow you to wait in order to answer. So we can finally put that aside and get back to what we're actually supposed to be doing. When it comes to our gradient, we want to make it nice and smooth and add a whole lot of color hues to make the transition as seamless as possible. We want to also make it really shiny so it actually looks like glass. After quickly making these gaps in between the pipes silver because you forgot to do that earlier, we can then move on to the tires. An important detail we need to include is a little bit of realism. That may seem absurd given how wacky our model and paint job are, but it's a very important thing that many people miss. It'll help the viewer suspend their disbelief and take our little model and animation a bit more seriously, as they won't be able to see how cool our things are if they're just laughing at how absurd it looks. By realism, I'm not thinking about things like fur glow or pitting, indenting, or ray tracing or whatever. I'm more thinking about how this model would naturally experience wear after being used. For instance, in regards to the tires, you'd see a lot of wear on the tread of the tires because that's constantly rubbing against the ground. That's why I'm making it a bit lighter than the rest of the tire, just to suggest that it's been well used. That's looking pretty damn good. Now we're going on to the black. We're going to highlight the black with very, very dark blue. We're doing this to add a bit of color variation, otherwise it would just look a bit dull like the tires, but that's not what we want for the main hull. Assuming you're not watching this tabbed out or doing something else, you may have noticed that these parts of the model just don't want to get painted. I believe it's something wrong with the UVs, but for the life of me I can't figure out what it is. I eventually managed to solve it just by painting at it from a different angle or something. If you know why this happens, feel free to message me because I'd really like to know. Our highlights are looking good, so we're just going to have a look around to see if everything's okay, and we immediately spot the problem. To fix the overspray, I literally just went back and repainted it, which was a lot easier for the silver than for the glow parts, but hey, a win's a win. Next, we're going to paint these pipey thingies. The idea is just to leave some nice amount of black in those recesses, and then very subtly keep highlighting up and up and up with the lighter blue. Eventually, we're going to end up with a very subtle looking model, but I think it's going to look really good for what we need it for. This did take an unfortunate amount of time. I am thinking of ways to speed it up in future. Maybe I layer the same UVs on top of each other so I only have to paint it once, but I'm not sure if that's going to work. Let me know in the comments. We're just going to quickly paint the thrusters. Thankfully nothing went wrong this time, but otherwise it's the same as before. The hull was a bit of a problem child. Despite being the biggest, it just would not catch paint on its vast surface. I'm really not sure what happened here, but the angle solution seemed to have worked once more. That's why you'll see me sometimes employing really bright paint, is just to double check where those problems are, because sometimes the dark blue is just a bit too subtle. On occasion it got so bad that I couldn't even erase a couple of overspray areas that I had accidentally gone over previously. These little wing flare thingies at the side of the hull was quite a bit kinder to me. It didn't seem to have nearly as many problems. In that vein, there isn't much more to talk about here. We just do what we did before, starting with a really dark black and then highlighting progressively lighter. It was quite fun to outline some of these parts though. It just looks so satisfying. All the black areas are done, so we're going to jump into the silver areas. After a bit of cleanup, we are going to thank ourselves for not using pure white now, because we're going to use it to highlight those brighter edges and keep our current color as the shadows. Because of its reflective nature and how bright it already looks, we're only going to use 3 hues for this as opposed to some of the more detailed areas. Thankfully, we'll make it nice and shiny, so you won't even notice. We'll move on to the guns now. They're going to be slightly different because of how curved they are. If they were all full of right edges, like what we just did, we would just follow the same steps. However, they are very rounded, which means we need to almost reverse our process, starting with the brightest edges in the corners and highlighting to a darker bit. We'll quickly move on to this rim thingy using the same steps as before to just make it look nice and shiny before going on to this cable holder or whatever. We're mainly going to highlight the upper end of this because most of it will be invisible, sort of clipping into the model, so we only need to do the top. We are quickly going to highlight the rims of the little vent thingy, which is a bit harder than it should be because once again it just refuses to take paint in certain places. We put the finishing touches on this before we eventually go to the wheel, where we're going to begin painting the rims. And we just go back to painting what we know, basically starting from dark and highlighting up to light. Although it must be said, the spokes do have some funny ideas on their own. That's looking glamorous once more, so now we can move on to the rim around the cockpit. It looks a bit funny now, but I believe it was actually using the texture of a different silver part that we've already done, so it just needed its own. We settle in for more of the same, but find that it seems to have gotten excited and sprayed all over the place for whatever reason. After erasing it, I tried it over and over again, but with always the same result. Eventually, I ended up fixing it by just painting directly in the UV editor. Soon enough, we're back to doing some piping hot highlights before finally going on to the thrusters. Here we've got a slight change of pace where, much like the guns, we're doing a reverse highlight because it's on a round surface. Here you can really see the difference between highlighting a sharp-edged and a round surface, where ultimately the goal is the same, but it is achieved using two different methods. This is looking fantastic, so all we need to do now is have a quick look around just to make sure we didn't miss anything, and as it turns out, we did. Alright, no big deal. We just put a little bit of black here, a little bit of highlights there, some silver, and we're done. Now, I've got a small confession to make. I knew from the beginning that I wanted this model to look a lot more black than it is right now, but I've been saving it till the end. So what I'm going to do is apply a small black wash all over all the blue areas, just to tone it back a bit. What we are essentially doing is painting over everything with a quarter strength black. All the painting is done. So what we're going to do now is just familiarize ourselves with how the model moves by, moving it around. This is not a thinly veiled excuse just to play with it like an action figure. The first step in animating is just to make sure everything is hooked up properly. We'll start by adding a hook modifier to the pipes, so it'll move as the thruster moves. Needless to say, but this will make the model look a whole lot more dynamic, as not everything will just be stock still as everything's moving. It also allows us to show how the various bits and bobs interact with each other, so extra points there. Next, we'll focus on the camera. It's important that the first shot of our animation is enticing without revealing too much, as we want the viewer to keep watching, but we also want them to stay invested. So it needs to contain a little bit of mystery and a hook. My plan is to have the car drive straight at the camera and brake just before contact. I hope that this will be fast-paced enough to keep people watching, but you can only see to the front of the car, so it spurs interest to think, ooh, I want to see the rest. Now that the more basic movements are down, we need to make sure that the model can actually do some of the more complex actions that we need of it. We're going to do this by just rigging them properly, which I've neglected to do up until this point. We're going to start with the guns. We just need to separate them so that they can recoil individually as we shoot them. The next step was to rig each thruster individually so that we've got more control over it and we can make some fluid looking animation. I was mulling it over here because it would be a lot of work. Fortunately, laziness won out, so I moved on to the tires. You'd think that would be a simple task, but apparently not. As it turns out, proportion mode was on, so as I was spinning the tires, the closest object next to it was also spinning. After switching that off, everything worked fine, and we could move on to the next step. We need this car to brake sharply in front of the camera, but it's going to look like a toy if it just comes to a stop. So in order to sell the realistic look, we need to have it tilt downward sharply, just as it comes to a stop, as if it's trying to carry on forward under its own momentum. Now that the establishing shots are done, we can get into the meat and potatoes of the animation. We want the camera to move up slightly, so we can see the model from a better angle than from the front. It is a bit flat in that regard. Second, we want the model to spin round, as we want this to be a nice showcase of what we've done. We want to add some dynamism, so it doesn't look so stiff while spinning. We'll do this by having the thrusters move up and down in a sort of wave-like shape. To achieve the effect I want, I need to animate each thruster individually. Sadly, it looks like some bozo didn't rig each thruster correctly, so I'll have to go and do that now. This is done by simply deleting half of them, duplicating them, and then giving them their own control nodes. All that drama out of the way, so now we can actually move them how I want them to. This is done by just having them go up and down individually, but spacing them out just enough so it looks like it's a wave being carried on. But we can't forget the big guns. Every time they shoot, they have to move backwards to simulate recoil. It's going to make them look nice and fancy. So the animating is done. All we need to do is make sure that the camera can see all our movements and everything, and make sure nothing is being left out. We can do this by just moving the camera around, just making sure everything is in frame. Let's not forget, we still have some detail below the model, so we'll make the camera move down so that nothing is missed. Finally, just add an area light to the back of the model so we can get some nice rim lights going. Then we take a cheeky screenshot and it's on to the glamour shots. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for watching and hopefully enjoying the video. If you did enjoy it, make sure to practice your good communication skills and let me know by the usual YouTube methods. That's all I had to say. I'll see you next time.